Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Adrian Andreus, and I serve as the Conference and Partnerships Manager here at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. I'm so glad you're joining us for this SRF365 webinar, Uncensored, Youth Voices Against Book Bans, part of our ongoing commitment to protecting the freedom to read, learn, and think for yourself. At Americans United, we believe that church-state separation is a shield that protects everyone's freedom, including the freedom to learn without censorship or religious control. The rise of book bans isn't just about what's on the shelves. It's about whose stories are silenced and who gets to define truth, identity, and belonging in our classrooms. One of my favorite banned books, Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, felt like someone handed me a mirror and a megaphone. It's a story about voice, agency, and a Black woman daring to define herself on her own terms. That's what makes these bans so dangerous. They're not just erasing ideas, they're erasing people. This week, as we recognize Banned Books Week, AU has been amplifying our ongoing efforts to combat censorship in public schools, from defending teachers and students targeted for sharing inclusive materials, to reminding lawmakers that public schools must serve all students, not just those who fit a particular religious mold. Before we dive in, a few quick housekeeping notes. Our interpreter for today is Patty. To enable ASL interpretation, click the interpretation icon, the globe in your Zoom toolbar. If you don't see it, you may need to update your Zoom client. Note this feature is not available via browser. For closed captioning, click the CC button in your meeting's control to enable live captions. You're welcome to post questions in the Q&A box at any time, and we'll do our best to uplift as many as we can during the discussion. Also, please note that this webinar is being recorded. All registrants will receive a follow-up email tomorrow with a recording link and any resources or toolkit shared during the session. Today's conversation is part of SRF365, a year-round virtual series presented by Americans United. These conversations offer a taste of the dynamic cross-issue programming that takes place at our annual Summit for Religious Freedom, also known as SRF. SRF creates an ongoing space for community, education, and action across movements, from church-state separation and religious freedom to racial justice, LGBTQ plus rights, reproductive freedom, and democracy itself. You can learn more at www.thesrf.org. And with that, I'll pass it over to our incredible moderator, Alicia Johnson, youth organizer and senior programs manager at Americans United, to guide us through this conversation. Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you, Adriana. I'm so excited to be here. Like she said, I get to work with young people across the country who care about the separation of church and state, true religious freedom, the ability of everyone to live as themselves, believe as they choose. And that importantly includes access to diverse stories, inclusive books, comprehensive education in our schools, in our libraries. And I'm so excited to moderate this panel and have a few experts join us to talk about their experience, their perspective for today's conversation. So today we have Katie Turcke, who is a senior at Pomona College and recently wrapped up her year with Americans United as a youth organizing fellow. We also have Azeemah Sadiq, who's a high school senior and serves as the Senior Policy Associate for Students Engaged in Advancing Texas, which is known as SEAT for short. And finally, we have Josie Mitz, who is the Campaigns Manager at PFLAG. Thank you all so much for being here. So we're going to start with a look at sort of how book bans are functioning and affecting folks across the country, why it's so important to protecting intellectual freedom, religious freedom, our democracy itself. I'm going to start with Katie. Tell us about your experience in your home state.
Yes, thank you so much, Alicia, for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here and to have the opportunity to discuss this with all of you. Book bans is a topic near and dear to my heart. I grew up in Idaho, and I had a lot of interactions with book bans and rhetoric surrounding book bans. It really stretched back to when I was in middle school. I spent a lot of time in libraries growing up. And one day I had, there was a banned book sort of set up in my library, in my middle school library. And the librarian actually told me, he kind of told me that discourse about book bans was increasing in Idaho. And he made a comment that was essentially, read those books while you still can. You might not have the same access to these books in a few years. And that really struck me because I'd never heard any sort of comment like that before. I'd heard about banned books, but I associated them with history and like historical subjects, not with the present or something that was a real risk now. And unfortunately, I went through high school, I went through middle school and high school, discourse about book banning increased in Idaho. And it increased in the districts neighboring my own school. I watched book bans happen. School boards voted for book bans in neighboring districts. And that sort of crescendo increased to the point where Idaho had its first book ban law or book challenge law pass in 2014, which was a law that basically it said minors should not have access to harmful or inappropriate material in public or school libraries, and gave people the option to challenge certain books such that they had to be removed to adult-only areas, which created a whole bunch of challenges. And that crescendo really got me, that sort of crescendo surrounding book bans and challenging books that culminated in that book ban law in Idaho really got me passionate about standing up for book bans, because as I grew up, I watched the books I was reading get challenged. And these were books that to me included a lot of diverse voices, books by minority authors, often in Idaho, books that included LGBTQ plus voices. And I noticed that people who were really proponents of banning those books often used religious language, or they would often refer to religious texts of their religion to sort of explain why those books should be banned. And that struck me as being something that was really problematic, and that sort of showed me the intersection of religious freedom and democracy with book banning. So that was my experience growing up in Idaho that allowed me to become passionate about book banning.
Yeah, absolutely. And you allude to this sort of recent uptick in book banning. While it's existed, unfortunately, historically, there have been efforts at censorship across decades. There are organizations like the American Library Association who track book banning efforts, and there really has been an uptick in recent years. You saw that in Idaho. Azeemah, you saw that in your state of Texas, too.
Absolutely, yeah. I can definitely speak on how Texas is affecting my community. Book bans are affecting my community in Texas. Like Katie said, what we see is that books that even slightly mention race, gender, sexuality, or religion are being banned. And that is extremely harmful because we know that book bans are detrimental to marginalized communities. They silence our voices and chip away at our democracy. When students walk into a library now, they don't feel the same sense of belonging because the stories that reflected who they are being taken off the shelves, which sends a clear message that they don't matter, or like their voices should be silenced. And that is extremely dangerous rhetoric. We know that limiting intellectual freedom really changes people's perception and their ability to understand the world around them. Inhibiting access to books is an attack on our freedom of expression, something that's, becoming increasingly threatened in today's political climate. And to me, I think what's most troubling about these decisions is that they're being made without input from students and the communities mostly affected, the very people whose stories are being erased.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, you know, like you're saying, young people walk into a library and don't get to feel that they see themselves, can be themselves. And at the macro level, right? If for all of us who envision a multiracial, multi-religion, pluralistic, right, diverse society, like book bans and intellectual freedom are sort of like cornerstones of enabling us all to like see ourselves, be ourselves, communicate our ideas, access ideas. And
Absolutely.
some politicians and white Christian nationalists don't want that to be the reality. Josie, working at PFLAG, you have a more national scope in working with folks across the country who care about book bans and many other issues related to LGBTQ plus freedoms and rights. And I'm curious, sort of your perspective on what you've seen of book bans impacting the communities you work with.
Yeah, I think that the first thing that we're seeing is that many people, when they think about advocacy or taking action or standing up for something that they believe in, that it is something that is closer to home for them, something that is directly impacting them or someone that they love, and that is definitely PFLAG's bread and butter. Sort of these folks who are either standing up for their child or a loved one, a grandchild, in schools who they recognize are suddenly experiencing book bans or not seeing themselves reflected in curriculum. And that has really sort of driven the advocacy portion of PFLAG, because we've gotten feedback from people who are going to school board meetings or have suddenly decided that they want to get involved, and what that sort of level of commitment looks like, and learning more about those local levels of government that truly impact those day-to-day decisions about not only what's like on shelves, but whether or not LGBTQ voices and other voices are even represented in the classroom, much like Katie talked about. And I think that there is something about sort of this entryway for people.
Unfortunately, it looks like Josie's internet is freezing up a little bit. We'll come back to you. But we'll stay on the topic of, Josie mentioned fighting at like local and policy levels to try to address book bans, that folks are noticing that these are happening in their communities and want to do something about it. And Azeemah, your organization is all about giving young people, students, a voice in the policy process, particularly at the state level in Texas. So tell us all about what SEAT does, how you've been fighting against book bans, and even, you know, other issues that intersect with book bans for your community.
Absolutely. I would love to. As Miss Alicia mentioned, I work with SEAT, Students Engaged in Advancing Texas, as a senior policy associate. Our main focus is on policymaking, legislative advocacy, and just any and every issue that are pertinent to students and education. A lot of my work revolves around ensuring young people, especially students, have a voice in decisions that directly impact them. We've pushed back against restrictive education policies like SB 12, HB 3, which divert public funds meant for public schools into private institutions. These bills would disproportionately impact students from rural communities, students with disabilities, and students like those from marginalized communities. I could also talk about of course, some of our biggest wins, which include partnering with the ACLU of Texas to sue the state over SB 12, which we know it's unconstitutional. It's an unconstitutional bill. Students deserve the rights to access diverse literature and affinity groups that give them that sense of belonging in schools. We've also seen progress in SB 10, the bill mandating the display of the Ten Commandments in every classroom. Specific public school districts are being challenged over it because it clearly violates the First Amendment. Schools should remain secular and protect every student's rights to religious freedom. Another major highlight for us was our Advocacy Day, where we were able to mobilize over 300 students to the Texas State Capitol to engage directly with legislators, testifying, sharing their stories, and advocating for inclusive education. So I think getting young people into those rooms, telling lawmakers and legislators how book bans and DEI restrictions affect them personally really shifts the tone of the conversation.
Yeah, so SB 12, to clarify for folks who might not know, what's the brief description of that?
Honestly, I'd really call it an anti-DEI bill. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Which
Yeah.
we've seen pop up in different states, and you really get to the sort of bigger picture here of all these different bills that you're working on are designed to sort of impose this one set of narrow, like, religious beliefs on everyone by limiting access to information, limiting inclusive programs, putting funding towards private religious schools rather than inclusive public schools that are open to everyone. And it's very exciting that you're, you know, mobilizing so many young people around those issues. And I love that you talked about wins, because I feel like it can feel very daunting, right? In a state with a political climate like Texas, where there's so many legislators fighting against inclusion and diversity and intellectual freedom and church state separation, but you find those opportunities for wins, which is awesome. And we have Josie back. Welcome. Thank you for bearing with some difficult Wi-Fi situation. I'd love to give you the floor if you had a closing thought you wanted to share, but also we can like transition into as well. You know, your organization mobilizes parents and families in particular. And when it comes to not just book bans, but book bans, the fight against book bans is an issue of framing and thinking about how book bans are good for parents, supposedly. You know, our opponents want to say it's an issue of, oh, it's parents' rights. These are good for parents. But that's not true, would you know? So tell us more about how your organization thinks about that and sort of how like parents are mobilizing in opposition to this framing.
Yeah, so PFLAG has been lucky enough to do and provide some folks for research with the Movement Advancement Project, which does a lot of work on sort of message testing and sort of having these sort of conversations with persuadables and people who are not necessarily 100% values aligned. And some of this research that's coming out of this is talking about the fact that censorship is at the core of this, right? That like talking about the politicians behind these bills intend to censor curriculum, books, teaching, all of it. And that, you know, talking sort of about like these conversations about like what's next, right? Are we gonna start teaching about slavery, banning books and banning books about the civil rights movement, and sort of having this sort of conversation about also the framing that the opposition wants, which is parents versus teachers, and that it's like a 1v1, and that it is this that there is not a movement behind this, and that it's become this singular monolith. And I think that is something that we're finding with parents who are speaking at school board meetings and attending their school board meetings, is that having that human connection and having these conversations and meeting with school board members, legislators, city council members, library board members, that like having that human connection dismantles that sort of wall and that sort of conversation. And like, I know that we're going to get into this, but sort of like that role of like parents and allies of people who are experiencing this, because again, PFLAG mainly works with people who are not in school, but like are supporting and loved ones. And so like recognizing that this is a way in which that allyship can show up for young people who are experiencing the brunt of this, right?
Yeah, I love that. So when, you know, someone says to you, this is about parents' rights. It's a parent's rights to choose which books their kids can read. What do you say? Or how do you reframe that?
Yeah, I think we talk about the fact that there are research also coming out of Listen, which is another LGBTQ organization, that it is not a parent's issue, right? That it is about the ability for students to feel seen and heard in their classroom, and that they are the people who are experiencing these things. And the research from Glisten actually indicates that teaching specifically about LGBTQ inclusive curriculum means that LGBTQ students are less likely to hear homophobic remarks, they're less likely to hear negative remarks about gender expression, and they actually perform better academically in school and are more likely to plan on post-secondary education. And so that it is not a parents versus school, it is impacting the young people who are receiving the education. It has nothing to do with parents.
Yeah, I'd love to bounce to Azeemah in particular, because your organization is so dedicated to mobilizing students, led by students. When you think about how you empower and equip the students you work with to speak with policymakers, to advocate against book bans, you know, kind of what does that look like? How are you mobilizing? How are you communicating about your values and about the issues that you care about?
Absolutely. I think one of the most effective ways to really get people to care is to really show them how these policies, these issues directly impact their lives and their communities. People are losing access to basic necessities like healthcare, education, and even representation. And many people don't realize that speaking up and making their voices heard can really change that. I think a lot of people don't understand how quickly book bans proliferate, deeply affecting students' sense of identity and belonging. Um, for example, when a student walks into a class and realizes that the book that they once loved, like Katie mentioned, the one that helped them see themselves for the first time is gone, that's erasure. And that's the kind of loss that leaves a real emotional impact. So I think helping people conceptualize that the fight is personal makes all the difference. And once they realize that it's happening in their own communities, in their own school districts, to students around them, they're much more, sadly enough, much more motivated to take action. So I think personalizing the issue really does help.
Yeah, that echoes kind of what Josie said about that importance of personal story and like sharing what the real impact of these is. Katie, you know, we've gotten to work together over the past year or so in the youth fellowship. You know, in your experience and working on these issues, you know, what has been kind of effective for you and like talking about these issues, trying to mobilize people to care and do something against, you know, to combat these book bans?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think one thing I've kind of learned is that it's helpful to approach the issue using different framing sometimes depending on your community or if there's a certain like ethos your community is particularly interested in. So for example, I attend school in California, but like I said, I grew up in Idaho, and book bans or the idea of book challenges is received very differently, even just in discussion day to day in a place like a small liberal arts college in Southern California than in Idaho. So I found it in some ways more challenging to talk about book bans in Idaho, but there are a few like framing techniques I found that have been really helpful. One of them is sort of using like the idea of personal freedom and personal belief, the ideas behind religious freedom. That really appeals to people in Idaho, I found. Idaho has sort of its a strong ethos of individual freedoms and wanting to have sort of like privacy for someone's own personal individual decision making. And I think a lot of what Idaho's done recently, as it sort of has had many laws that have passed that have challenged religious freedom in Idaho. One of the things that's always helpful for me to point out, or that I found to be really helpful, is to point out like these laws go totally counter towards ideas of individual choices or individual freedom. I mean, for example, the law I mentioned about book challenges that allows other parents or other people who don't even have kids in schools or don't have kids who are reading at these public libraries to determine what other kids read, and not just other kids of, you know, like it, not just other kids who maybe are your own kids' age, but it's an umbrella term for all kids under the age of 18. It determines not just what, you know, 5-year-olds or elementary school kids can read, but what 17-year-old kids can read. So one thing I found really helpful is to sort of get into the conversation by approaching it as a matter of like personal freedom and personal individual choices, being able to decide for yourself or for your children what you want them to engage with potentially, but not what other children of other ages, other backgrounds get to engage with. And that's one tool I found to be pretty helpful in discussing what could be a potentially difficult topic.
Totally. That is so important. That idea that politicians should not be imposing their beliefs on us and our families. One of the other interesting stats that I saw from the American Library Association is that actually 72%, the vast majority of book bans, folks who are advocating for book bans, are actually like outside groups or government entities themselves and not parents, right? We were talking about how this actually isn't a pro-parent or pro-family policy. Book bans are sought by folks who want to impose their ideas on everyone else, and only 16% of people seeking book bans are parents, and 12% of those people are someone else. And so that's so important in a good like way of thinking about kind of the framing or the issues that are going on and kind of at stake here. So some of you have alluded to this already, but I think it's really important to talk about how important it is to be in community, in collaboration with other people and organizations when we're fighting these fights, and we're just more powerful when we work together. So I'd love to hear from your perspectives the ways that you as an individual or as a group have been working as part of a broader movement. Azeemah, I'll start with you because I know that SEAT has partnerships with other organizations in this fight. Tell us more about, what that looks like.
Absolutely. I love this question because I truly believe that collaboration is honestly what keeps this movement strong and sustainable. In Texas, SEAT, we've been working closely with national partners like Pan America, the NCAC, which, oh my gosh, what is it stand for? National Coalition Against Censorship, the Freedom to Read Project, and along with other youth-led initiatives fighting against book bans and for education access. On the local level, we've built coalition between student-led organizations, librarians, educators, people who might experience book bans differently, but still share one goal, which is protecting our intellectual freedom. And of course, in honor of Banned Book Week, SEAT, we are collaborating with numerous organizations across the state to host different events, trying to increase awareness of the threat of book bans that pose, of what book bans pose, like this webinar, spaces that celebrate banned book literature and remind people that our voices have real power to really create change. I feel like when we unite efforts, we are truly able to make a larger and lasting tangible impact all over. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Josie, something you said earlier reminded me of one of the other young people in our network, who actually is also from Texas, one of our winners of our student contest last year, who wrote about and spoke at the Summit for Religious Freedom about combating a book ban in her school district. And it all started with a conversation with one of her teachers. And there was this sort of looming threat of a book ban in their school district. And with the support of the teacher, they started mobilizing students. They got in touch with parents and found other concerned community members. And they really found so much like power in just realizing, oh, there's other people who care about this. We can rally together. We can, draft our remarks together. And even though they unfortunately, weren't successful in stopping the book ban, they felt so successful in being able to say something to show that it's not okay and to create a community of folks who care about access to information. And Josie, that reminded me of what you were saying about how sometimes a parent just goes to a school board meeting and is like, oh my gosh, like this is happening in my community. What do I do? So I'd love your perspective too on like what that collaboration and community looks like in combating book bans in, at a national level, what you do.
Yeah, I think that the thing that allows when you have a network as big as PFLAG, which is we're at 360 chapters across the country, including 60 in the last year, which we've seen a large uptick in creation of new chapters, a lot because of not only what's happening nationally, but at local levels. Like I said before, that it's sort of like this pivot to this is my community and it's impacting the people that I care and love. And I think that it is this sort of understanding that there are people who agree with you in your community just by being present and attending a school board meeting and taking notes and going back to your PFLAG chapter or another meeting, or if you're a member of I'm a Unitarian Universalist, if you're like a member of your local congregation, if it's going to a meeting that is unrelated to anything, just like in your normal circles. And I think it's sort of this destigmatizing of this is political, this is movement work, and recognizing that it's all connected, right? And that the changing of hearts and minds and the impact that we can have as a community goes much deeper than just groups, and it's sort of how we're going to be able to change things at all levels. And I think it is something that has led me to PFLAG from my previous work, and has sort of led me to this understanding that community-based organizing, where we allow young people to also lead the charge when it is affecting them the most, and figuring out what the best way to collaborate with them and listen to the people who are most impacted by these decisions, and figuring out that the best thing that we can do is that we support them as they speak at school board meetings, and we're there to help decompress afterwards, or, you know, provide snacks, whatever that the parents and the supporters can provide. Or if it is speaking out because students don't feel comfortable doing that when they're speaking out against people who could retaliate against them. And that collaboration allows for a stronger movement and overall.
Definitely. I have a couple questions I'm going to ask the panel, but we are approaching time for some Q&A for the audience, and I see some are coming in, so keep putting your questions in the Q&A box, and we will get to those shortly. But I'd love each of you to share sort of what are the resources that you found useful that your organization can offer, right? For folks who are in the audience who want to learn more, who want to out of this conversation, who want to address book bans in their communities or at a broader level. What are the resources out there, and what would you encourage them to do like next with what they've learned today? Who should I call on first? Azeemah?
I think the best place to start is local. Talking to your legislators, your representatives. You are their constituents, and they have a responsibility to listen to you and act on your concerns. As Josie said, attending your local school board meetings and speaking up about how book bans and censorship really are affecting you and your community. Connecting with organizations like SEAT, PEN America, the Texas Freedom to Read Project, and of course, Americans United, having lots of great resources, toolkits, and trainings, opportunities for you to get involved. SEAT, we offer, particularly for students, because that is our demographic, we offer different fellowships, empowering and educating you on how to mobilize against issues like book bans and other issues that really are impacting your communities. Yeah, and I think something to kind of note is that to never really underestimate the power of starting small, like hosting a banned book club, for example, creating a community read event, or even something as simple as like sharing banned book titles with your friends can really spark important conversation that challenge censorship and build understanding. At the end of the day, it is those like small, consistent actions that really push us towards a more inclusive, equitable society, one that everyone's story deserves to be heard.
Yeah, that's so important. Like I was saying before, these policy fights can feel so daunting, but starting small matters, like putting this issue on people's radar, having a conversation, making sure people feel connected to like the values of like access to information, like the importance of public schools, right? Just having those conversations can be so important, even when it feels small. If we're all having these conversations all over the country all the time, it makes a difference. Katie, what might you add to this list of what folks can do, what resources folks should access?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was a really great answer from Azeemah. I think I would echo a lot of that. I think I agree that like it's great to partner with organizations if you can find organizations in your community or chapters of larger organizations. AU, Americans United, was really the first organization that focused on church-state separation that allowed me to sort of step in to sort of my power as an advocate and to learn how to really feel empowered as an advocate to get into grassroots organizing. So sort of getting in the door with AU and being a fellow with them was so empowering for me. It allowed me to work with other organizations, as Azeemah's mentioned, like the National Coalition Against Censorship, and various other organizations, even locally. And I also want to echo that it's important to just take small actions in the community. You don't have to join an organization even, or to be part of a fellowship, or to be part of anything super formal. Something as simple as like Azeemah mentioned, banned book clubs or local banned book reading groups can be really powering, and they do one of the most important things to me, which is just connect you, get you in a room with even a really small group of people who feel the same way, who maybe are in your community and understand both like the national overarching challenges of book bans, but also the way that it manifests locally in your community. So I think, I want to echo a lot of what Azeemah said, and that it's sort of a twofold approach I've taken personally, connecting with both local groups and small organizations, and also getting involved in groups, larger groups like AU or the National Coalition Against Censorship, where I've been able to sort of look at the issue from a national angle, both to work really well together, I think.
Awesome. And Josie, I know you have a more practical resource, a toolkit that's coming out soon that we wanted to give you the chance to share about with folks.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the platform to talk about the campaign I've been building for the last 6 months. Anytime you want. PFLAG is launching a campaign at our convention, which is why I have terrible Wi-Fi connection at a hotel. That is focused on, I think that we've touched on this a lot, this like local understanding. But one of the big pillars of it is educating, right? And learning about your own community and how decisions are made, and talking about those decision makers. Because a lot of, especially as we talk about specifically book bans, that there are some communities where parents just bring up that they would like to remove a book from a shelf, and it's like this very small group of like 5 people who make these decisions, and sort of just like learning about your community and then talking about different ways that you can take action, and making sure that it's is as flexible as it can be, whether, like I said before, it's just attending the school board meeting and learning what's happening and then talking to your friends about it, or if it's signing a pledge to take action, or if it is taking the further step and speaking at those meetings, right? And finding that level of comfortability, but recognizing that when we do it together as a movement and as community, that's when the impact, and we can really start to see the changes of the opinion and the conversation just happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate all of your insights and this conversation so much. And I'm excited to bring our audience into the conversation a little bit here. We're getting some questions that I'm going to share. One is wanting to hear more about this kind of conflict around parents' rights in education. Charles from Nebraska actually serves on a local school board and says that there's been a lot of conversations about parents' rights in education. How do you see parents' rights aligning or conflicting with students' rights in schools and in this issue, the sort of forum of public education more broadly? Parents' rights and students' rights. How does that come up for you all? Azeemah, I know that your organization has written a students' Bill of Rights that frames a lot of your advocacy. How did that come about? How is that a part of the work that you do and how you think about the issues that you advocate for?
Absolutely. So how that came about, honestly, as you may or may not know, there's a lot of policies, a lot of detrimental policies that were enacted, that were passed throughout this Texas legislature. We feel like students again deserve an inclusive education, an inclusive quality education, and that's what came about with our Student Bill of Rights. We by, I guess, being selective of what students can or can't read, we're choosing to undereducate an entire generation and leaving them without, I'd say, the ability to think critically. Because when we incorporate more diverse literature, students are able to really broadly understand themselves and the world around them, I'd say. I think I missed the latter part of your question.
No, that's really helpful. I was trying to think about, because we talked about how the opposition uses parents' rights so often, but we hadn't really talked about students' rights. And I knew that seat had that Students' Bill of Rights. And so I think that's just like a really powerful like framing for the work that you do of like, this is what students deserve, and don't leave
Absolutely.
us out of the conversation.
Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
Another one of our guests from North Idaho asked about parental rights as well, but specifically that that they have not been able to get young people involved in their advocacy as much. So I'm guessing this is an older activist, not a young person themselves. And so how do you think about engaging young people or adults or older adults' roles as allies in the fight, and how they can engage and support young people in the work?
Oh, sorry.
Katie?
Yeah, I can speak on. I mean, super exciting to hear there's someone from North Idaho attending this. So hi, yeah, I have family in North Idaho in Moscow. So um, yeah, I think that's a great question. I sort of shared my story of one of the first things that got me even aware of the issue of book bans was a local librarian or a middle school librarian talking to me about the dangers of book bans and saying, you know, like the books that you're holding in your hand right now are books that basically have been challenged to different areas and you might not have the same access to them in the future that you do right now. And I think that that sort of speaks to one thing you can do to help get students involved is to show them how much the issue affects them, and not just that it affects them, but that sort of the narrative and the rhetoric of parents' rights versus students' rights, or of parents' rights in general, treats students, particularly middle age, high school age students, like they don't have their own decision making power, or like they can't be treated or trusted to know what to read or to read their own material. And I think that that's something that I found even before I knew a lot about book bans, the very like logic of that argument or of Idaho's book ban bill but we need to protect students, that they can't evaluate their own learning or critically engage with different materials, that made me really indignant. And like out of that feeling of indignancy was kind of where my curiosity about this issue came from, that allowed me to keep going and learn more about it. So it's sort of like at one level, I would say that maybe one thing that helped me get involved was just someone talking to me and sort of saying like, you might not have these books anymore, and then also trying to draw their attention to sort of, these are politicians, policymakers, often interest groups, saying that they know better than you do. As someone who's grown up, who goes to the school, who goes to these libraries every day, who wants to read all these things, I think that sort of drawing attention to that argument and that logic was really helpful to want me to get involved. And I guess at a broader level, how that could work is sort of partnering with whatever organizations you're in or whatever groups you already talk to, and figuring out ways to communicate with students or to platform with students to draw attention to the arguments that are being made about them and the decisions they should have the ability to make for their own life and their own reading.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I was still on the unmute there for a second. That's such an important framing too, of like, not, you know, here's what you need, but you know, you deserve to decide what you need or what you want, or what you want to read and have access to, that you as a young person have your own autonomy, and being as someone who maybe has more resources or is connected to like working with an organization or a policy campaign, can say like, how can I enable you, if you want to like join us in this fight and support you in this fight. Obviously there are organizations like Azeemah's that is young people working with young people for young people. But often we see adult-led organizations that have to share resources and create space and opportunities for young people. And by treating them as the like individual thinkers and like powerful like advocates that they are, or that they can be, is so important as we think about like how we can be not just like asking young people to join us, but asking young people how we can, you know, support them and being like in collaboration with them. Azeemah, Josie, anything you want to add about sort of, you know, how, you know, adults and young people can work in partnership in this advocacy?
Absolutely. I think one of the biggest things you can do is honestly to provide more opportunities for collaboration and I guess guidance. For me, how I kind of got into book bans, when I came to America 8, 9 years ago, I found like one of my favorite books, The Hate You Give, um, which really gives a raw perspective on how racism in America truly is. And I didn't understand that, of course, until I came here. And then um, I think at a conference, my friend Oyen, which is the person that actually got me introduced to Seats, spoke so fervently about how books are being banned. Mind you, I had no interaction, like I had no idea books were being banned until that point. And then and she told me like my favorite book, like the book like I literally saw myself in, like in the character Star, was being banned. I was like, oh wow, like, and that's what got me thinking. I'm like, okay, why is this happening? You know, what is going on? Um, and then she introduced me to Seats, and Seats again definitely gave me the guidance and really I kind of knew what was happening. It was just the how to. So I think a lot of young people already have the ideas, already have the passion to make change. We just need the right resources and guidance to really bring those ideas to fruition. So I think what organizations and like I guess adults can do is really helping us amplify our voices and giving us a real seat at the table of like supporting initiatives that are youth led or community centered. I think when young people are empowered, we are able to create more solutions that are impactful and inclusive for everyone.
I love that. Thank you. We have another question. I don't know, Katie, if you recruited all the people you know in Idaho, but Mary from Idaho has a question about back in the policy arena. So Mary said that it's difficult to get elected officials in the state where the legislators overwhelmingly one party, one political leaning. And I know that's true in Texas as well. And I'm sure in many of the places, Josie, that you've organized. So when it comes to trying to organize and get folks to listen on issues like book bans, when they might be on the opposite side coming into the conversation, are there ways that you find that you're able to break through and connect with those folks? I know we talked earlier about the power of storytelling. Have you seen that, work in your experience? Are there other ways of kind of breaking through into difficult political environments?
Yeah, that's a
Katie?
great question. And very exciting that there's so many Idahoans on this webinar. But yeah, that's something I've definitely encountered myself. It feels like there is definitely one political party who is in control and has a strong hold over the legislature and over who is passing these laws and supporting these laws. I would say a few things I found effective so far is one thing that I mentioned earlier, which is emphasizing the sort of like personal liberties, individual freedoms argument. Um, Another thing I would say that's worked in my experience when I was in high school, not just on book banning advocacy, because I wasn't quite involved in book banning advocacy specifically till I was in college, but on other issues as well, is when high school students or teenage age students show up to the legislature or to school boards in overwhelming numbers, which Azeemah's sort of talked about so far too. But I think it's really hard for members of the legislature or for other adults in making these decisions who all believe sort of the same thing or agree, and it's hard to feel like you can impact their opinion. It's hard in the logic of book banning in particular to say like this is dangerous for students, this is harmful for students, this is inappropriate for these students if you show up and say, I am a student and it's not. And what you're doing is harmful because I can't access the things I want or the things I want to read. I can't explore what education should be allowing me to explore. This undermines educational freedom for me. Like I'm in these schools. And again, that has worked for me across different issues, not just related to book bans. But when I grew up in Idaho, it was helpful to sort of be um, in the room when those kind of almost paternalistic arguments are being made to say like I'm a student and this is not helpful to me and this is not protecting me um, in any way. And I think a final quick thing I'll mention is that Idaho is like other states sometimes tends to when it makes these rules that are sort of motivated by religious beliefs, it's motivated by particular majority religions and by a narrow set of religious beliefs. And if someone is saying, for example, like, I want, this hasn't necessarily happened in Idaho yet, but I want these religious commandments displayed in the classroom, and that should be totally okay. And then you say, well, we flip the logic and say, what if a different religion? Why can't we, if it's really religious freedom, if this is religious freedom, why can't the opposite be true? We display other religious symbols or text in the classroom as well. And that sort of flips the argument on its head. So there's kind of a few general like strategies or sort of rhetoric that I found effective in Idaho, or just talking to a large group that sort of controls decision making.
Azeemah or Josie, any other tactics or ways that you've been able to break through in more difficult political conversations? All about those stories.
I say I definitely just echo what Katie said. Like, as students, just showing up and sharing like your personal perspectives, because you are the ones directly being impacted by these policies. I think is so important. In terms of strategies, it definitely gets hard talking because a lot of times I feel like people are, first of all, kind of uneducated about the matter and still speaking up. For example, um, or like, yeah, I say uneducated about the matter, in the sense of that, like, it doesn't it doesn't really impact you. Like, why would you be on the front lines and telling people, oh, this is how this should go, when again, it doesn't impact you. So I think it definitely gets hard trying to break through that barrier. Um, yeah, it's hard. Yeah.
Yeah, I get that. And, we talked about earlier how, you know, it can take years to win in the policy arena. It can be an uphill battle. And it is absolutely still a win to do something and to bring people together and to educate people about this issue. Even if you're not seeing the book ban get overturned tomorrow, having people hear that it matters, maybe changing a couple hearts and minds along the way, maybe distributing books, right, yourself along the way, right?
Yes.
Doing what politicians don't want us to do until we can make sure the laws truly like protect separation of church and state, protect intellectual freedom, protect all of our ability to live as ourselves. Like, that is a lifetime and beyond's fight. And it's worth doing it, and it's a win just to like be a part of that and find the small ways that we can make a difference. I want to end on kind of jumping off. Azeemah, you talked about The Hate U Give as being a really powerful book for you. And I would love to give everyone the opportunity, as I close us out, to share one book that you love, particularly if it's a banned book. I'd love to just like close us out on how powerful and special and important reading and access to stories can be for all people, especially young people. When I was reflecting on, this topic and banned books week coming up, it took me back to high school when I read The Handmaid's Tale for the first time. And it just gave me language and context to something I had been seeing in the world around me. And that book always has like stayed with me. And I remember, writing a book report about it, and like, it just, little feminist Alicia has learned so much, by reading. And I'd love to hear if anyone else, if you have a book that you would love to just celebrate as we celebrate banned and challenged books this week. I didn't prep you for this, so Katie.
Yeah, I think one that I really enjoy was The Perks of Being a Wallflower. That's something I read years ago that I really liked. I'm not sure if it's been challenged in Idaho specifically, but I've seen it on like the Penn's list of banned books, and by the American Library Association listing it as a banned book. And it never struck me as a book that would be banned. I think it talks about difficult things in a way that young readers could really like utilize, or just sort of would be a helpful perspective to share. And other books I've also seen being banned that I was really surprised by was a lot of John Green books. John Green was one of my favorite authors like growing up, and several of his books sort of are on some of the book ban lists. So I think those are sort of John Green books, and then Perks of Being a Wallflower would be a few of my examples of banned books that I really loved to read as a kid.
Awesome. Josie, any you want to shout out?
There were a couple that I recognized that when I was in college as an Asian American, I like didn't quite really understand the model minority mindset and like what that had done to my upbringing and sort of the life that I was living. But My Life Growing Up Asian in America is a book that I read that sort of like put into perspective, like I think we've sort of reiterated just sort of like the feelings I'm having, but in writing and like feeling seen and heard.
Amazing. Thank you all so much for jumping on that question, which I threw at you last minute, but also just sharing your brilliant ideas and your experience and all these great resources for our listeners. I am so lucky that I got to moderate this conversation. Thank you for letting me do it. And we're going to invite Adriana to come back on and close us out.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you to our speakers for your honesty and courage, and to all of you for joining us. Today's was a powerful reminder that book bans aren't just what's on the shelves. It's about who gets to be seen and heard. And that freedom is the freedom to exist. And that's what we're protecting. You'll get the recording and resources in your inbox soon. And to stay connected with SRF365 and Americans United, visit thesurf.org or follow us on socials. Thanks again, and take good care.